Welcome back to Hansraj's e-Samvaad, established under the Ministry of Education, Government of India in collaboration with Hansraj College, University of Delhi. This is a new lecture series on the GE readings on Indian diversity and literary movements offered by the Department of English across the various colleges of the University of Delhi. Welcome to the second lecture of this series. My name is Piyush Chaudhary and I am currently Assistant Professor at the Department of English at Hansraj College. I welcome you all to the second lecture in the series on GE, Readings on Indian Diversity and Literary Movements. In the previous lecture, that is the first lecture, I discussed the basic introduction to this entire paper. It was a very important lecture and you must visit that lecture before going on to this one. And as we know, the course, this particular course will cover folk, oral, written, verbal, literatures. It will include Dalit literatures, it will include tribal literatures, it will include Sufi and Bhakti traditions written in languages like Hindi, Urdu, Kannada, Dogri, English, Marathi and so on and so forth, the various languages that are found in India, right. So, we will be reading a collection of several poems, short stories, essays and articles. But before we actually begin with the syllabus, we have to tackle the very basic question, and that is, how shall we study literature? Shall we just summarize it and study it like we used to do at the basic school level, or is there some other way? The answer to this question, how to study literature, is the very first topic that we will discuss, and that is Sujit Mukherjee's essay Propositions. So, how would you study literature? These are some of the basic answers, these are the things that Sujit Mukherjee tells you. Basically, in this chapter, in this essay, Propositions by Sujit Mukherjee, he is giving you a blueprint. He is giving you a roadmap on how to study Indian literature. So, in short, Unit 1 explains how Indian literature must be studied. He gives a theoretical viewpoint that it must be studied differently as it is richly diverse. Indian literature is richly diverse. It's very vast, and at the same time, after every 15 to 100 kilometer radius in our country, the languages change, the dialects change basically. The dialects change, the way in which literature is written is change. So, what is the way in which we should be studying, literature? These things are, Sujit Mukherjee is trying to give us answers to these questions through different examples. For example, he gives the example of Tulsidas, he gives the example of Mahabharata and so on and so forth. I will be covering all of them, as our lecture proceeds. Then this chapter will also tell you how a literary form, how the novel as a form, how poetry as a form travels from one language to another, right? And this chapter will also tell you how literary history is actually written. Often, literary history, when we talk about how to write, how literary history is usually written, its focus is on a single language and the literary currents flowing through it in different ages, for example, in English literature. But according to Mukherjee, this is wrong and insufficient for a country like India. In India, there are so many languages, so many vastly varying different cultures. Hence, to study them in isolation, to study each culture in isolation is not possible. You cannot study it in isolation. You have to study it by clubbing it together. So, Mukherjee proposes that Indian literature be studied not through a single language literature. So, therefore, as I said a while ago, this essay gives us new ways, to read Indian literature. Mukherjee prescribes a very holistic and a very comprehensive method. And what is that method? He says that you have to keep in mind the consideration the fact that India is a multilingual country, right? Since India has no one language, hence Indian literature cannot be studied with one language. That's all what Mukherjee is basically trying to say, right? So, at the root of any literature, we all know that at the root of any literature is language, and language is the source of literature. You can understand it this way. And because there is no one language in India and so many different dialects every few hundred of kilometers in India, therefore Indian literature cannot be studied with one language, right? You need a very, what you can say, a multi-dimensional perspective, right, of reading Indian literature. Then Mukherjee also talks about the existence of multilingualism in ancient literary cultures as well. So, you must have heard of Kalidas, the famous Indian playwright, right? It's unfortunate that people call Kalidas as the Shakespeare of India, but the fact is Kalidas was writing around 2000 years ago. Shakespeare was writing merely 500 years ago, 400, 500 years ago, right? But the colonial mindset is such that we tend to call Kalidas as Indian Shakespeare. This is a cultural hegemony. This is a cultural hijacking of Bharatiya knowledge and Bharatiya traditions. What the West has done is, the West has infused it in our minds through the colonial rule, that Kalidas is Indian Shakespeare. But this is absolutely false. This is wrong, right? So rather Shakespeare should be called as the British Kalidas, and rightly so, because Shakespeare was writing just 400, 500 years ago. I mean, he was a prolific writer, and there was no such playwright, till today to match his skills, undoubtedly. But he should be called as a British Kalidas, as he comes much, much later than Kalidas. But anyway, let us come to our main point after this brief digression. So, Mukherjee says that in Kalidas's plays, different characters speak different languages. And this shows that language also are markers of social position. Mukherjee says, and he cites, in this essay in your syllabus, he cites Abhigyan Shakuntalam by Kalidas, where characters speak different languages. And each character speaking different language reflected the multilingual society of that era. Hence, since ancient times, it is a proof that our society was multilingual, right? And therefore, to study it in a single unitary approach would be insufficient. It would be incorrect. So this essay, therefore, stresses the importance of studying literature within its historical, political, and cultural context, rather than isolated summaries. So that is what is introduced in this particular chapter, the first one, right? In the very first, which is Propositions by Sujit Mukherjee. Then, according to Mukherjee, how should Indian literature be studied? He says that Indian literary traditions comprise of many languages and many techniques and many themes. They are heterogeneous, right? Hence, a chronological or a period-wise approach is not possible in India. The question that you might be wondering is that why can't Indian literature be studied like English literature? Because India has, as I've mentioned, hundreds of languages, hundreds of dialects, right? Unlike English literature, which is based on one single language, right? Unlike English literature, Indian literature requires what we can call a holistic approach, a multilingual, multidimensional approach, because there is this multicultural complexity due to the multilingual nature of Indian literature, right? Now, this brings me to a quote by Sujit Mukherjee, and he says that, unlike English literature, it's easy to write the history of English literature or French literature or American literature or Italian or any other literature, because it is monolingual. But in the case of India, it is not at all correct. And look at these lines, that he mentions in this particular essay. He says, and I am quoting it: writing a history of Sanskrit literature up to the 12th century is easy. It is when we extend the review of our literary past down to the 20th century that the diachronic strategy no longer seems valid. For at least the last 5 centuries, we had no single dominant language of literature. Instead, we had to regard each modern Indian language as separate in terms of their literary achievements, and proceeded to write separate histories of literature of each language. So these lines that I just now read from the text, they are the crux of this entire essay, right? So he says that the conventional method of reading and studying literary historiography is wrong. Even if it's not wrong, it's insufficient for the context of Indian literature. This conventional old method is wrong in the context of Indian literature. It can be used in Britain because there is hardly any dialect, right? But in Indian literature, there is an urgent need to study Indian literature in a multidimensional manner, keeping in view the multilingual nature of India, because there is no predominant language here, right? So the conventional old method will prove insufficient. Then as we move forward, he also talks about some of the drawbacks of reading Indian literature if we study it in parts. This is a very important point, right? So basically, Mukherjee is saying that we need to read Indian literature not in parts, right? So for this, he gives the example of Tulsidas to illustrate this point, and it's a very important point. It's an important point in the essay, and several times, an examination question has been, created from this particular area. So he says that Tulsidas is basically a poet of medieval India, and a poet of Hindi language, and a poet of Hindi literature, of Indian literature. These three are different points, right? Look at the quote. You'll be able to understand this by reading this quote better. He says, to illustrate this loss by an example, Tulsidas is generally regarded as a great poet. For this greatness to be convincing, it ought to become apparent in an ascending order of magnitude. First, Tulsidas as a great poet of medieval India. Second, as a great poet in the history of Indian poetry. and finally as a great poet of Indian literature. That is, considering all other Indian languages through time. These would seem to be the obvious orders of measurement in any literary achievement. But given our present procedures, Tulsidas is evaluated mainly as a Hindi poet. The first and the third orders suggested here never received due consideration. Very important point, right? So he says that Tulsidas should not just be seen as a Hindi poet, right? The other two ways are not associated with him. This is wrong, because he was a great medieval poet and a great Indian poet as well, right? So to correctly analyze the position of Tulsidas, you need to take into account all these three aspects. This is what Mukherjee is saying. This is where we are going wrong. This is what he is suggesting, right? So therefore, Mukherjee offers his proposition, his proposal to develop a new critical comprehensive approach, because to understand Indian literature in one way is wrong, right? Hence we need to accommodate this new method which we just now read in our studying of Indian literature, right? It's not a good thing to read Indian literature in a unidimensional way. It will be wrong, right? Basically, to simplify it, he means that we can't judge any author based on one single fact. So Tulsidas, he is not just an Awadhi poet but also a great Hindi poet and also a great poet of Indian literature. So this is the multi-dimensional manner, keeping into aspect, all those three points. Now, very important lines again, and you can say that this is the crux of what Mukherjee is saying. It's a short two-line quote that I am quoting. He says, what we need therefore is a broad spectrum view of our literary past as basis of alternative mode of literary history, right? So basically in this chapter, in this essay propositions, Mukherjee is giving you a blueprint. As I mentioned, he is giving you a roadmap. In contrast to Western literature, Indian literature has multicultural complexity, because we have multiple cultures. We have so many different languages. We have so many different ways of expression. So many different languages, cultures, multicultural complexity is there, right? Multicultural complexity is an important term. These are unique to Indian history and Indian literary history. He also talks about the anti-establishment role of and the independent role of a poet during the Middle Ages, when the poet had a sense of revolt and he was a religious reformer as well. And by the way, we'll be coming to the next unit shortly, which is Bhakti and Sufi tradition. We'll be talking about the idea of revolt and reforming the society in that particular unit. So in this unit, but concluding, Sujit Mukherjee basically goes on to explain the different ways in which we can read literature. Then he also talks about how literary forms travel from one language to another, right? So he mentioned that the literary forms which basically came from the West, for example, the novel emerged in India. It was not an original a literary production of India. I mean, the novel as a form was taken from the West, right? And it was cultivated by firstly the Bengali writers. The earliest novels in India can be found in Bengal. Then he also gives the example of Nazrul Islam, who wrote ghazals and how he was influenced by Persian traditions. So this is how literary forms travel from one culture to another freely, right? So therefore, one of the major ideas of this essay is that he explains some important critical features and characteristics about Indian literature, about how literary forms develop, and about how one should correctly study Indian literature with the correct methodology, right? So therefore, as students of literature, while we are studying literature, we also have to understand, while we are studying it, we have to understand the literary form and the emergence and the development of the form, rather than merely understanding the old hackneyed summaries and old themes of any story or novel or poem. So the form here basically means the form basically means the genre, the poetry, the ghazal, the short story, essay, novel, right? This is the way one should study old Indian literature, and not in the old fashioned, obsolete, worn out manners, right? So lastly, towards the end of the essay, Mukherjee goes on to explain his concept of tradition. This is also one important point, and the essay ends here. So according to him, he says that tradition should be attached to the primary text from which any literary piece has come up. For example, the Ramayana tradition, the Krishna tradition, the Bhakti tradition, he also mentioned the Brihat Katha tradition, right? And so on and so forth. So basically, in this case, he is trying to explain us that the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are used by different languages in India by different authors as a raw material, and that is why it is considered the mother of all literatures in India. So this is the original tradition. This is because these two major texts, which form the part of our tradition, has been the source of inspiration for new literary works in all times and all languages of India, right? Then he also cites the example of Ramayana and Mahabharata, which were originally composed and were written with many changes and embellishments to the original story, right? We'll be reading Chandrabati Ramayana, one such example will emerge, right? So we'll see that. So all of this is part of the original tradition. So with this definition of tradition, Mukherjee concludes the essay on this note, and the essay also ends here. So I will very briefly once again summarize what I discussed in detail above. In summary and in totality, Sujit Mukherjee says that the chronological study of literary works cannot encompass the true essence of Indian literature, as there is no single language literature in India. This is because India is a multilingual society, and its uniqueness is its multi-diverse and what you can say, its multicultural complexity. Unlike say English literature or British literature, we cannot read Indian literature in a single language. In India, there are multiple languages and they influence each other. So a broad spectrum view is required. What is this meaning of this broad spectrum view? It means taking into account the social, the political, the cultural aspects of literature. Therefore, this should be the distinct mode of studying Indian literature according to Sujit Mukherjee. Basically, as I said, Mukherjee is offering you a reformulation, a revisitation, a restructuring to the approach of writing literary history. This is because there are certain hurdles in writing history of Indian literature. And what are the hurdles in writing history of Indian literature? The readers might have a question, why writing a chronological history of literature in India is difficult? First and foremost, it is because of the multiplicity of languages and dialects in India. As we don't have any single dominancy of any language, we cannot read Indian literature as one. Thus, it is difficult to write a chronological history of literature in India. Then another reason for why it is, due to which it is difficult to write a chronological history of Indian literature is because, in India, literature is also not written in any one language. So it is multilingual. Thus, we cannot read or write Indian literature in a homogeneous manner, right? We cannot give undue advantage to any one language, right? So thus, it is difficult to write a chronological history of literature in India, as Sujit Mukherjee's essay is trying to explain. So I hope the readers were able to understand and appreciate the propositions given by Mukherjee. He's basically giving us a proposal, and that is his suggestion, his roadmap, his blueprint on how to study literature, which I just discussed in this lecture. I will now end the lecture. I hope that I succeeded in making this complex essay a bit easy for the students, and I sincerely hope it added some value to your understanding of the essay. Please feel free to raise your doubts, your comments, your suggestions, questions, in the comment section below, and don't forget to share the video with others preparing for their exams. I will see you very shortly in other parts of readings in Indian diversity and literary movements. In the coming days, I'll be creating a playlist and I'll be attaching all the videos there. Thank you, goodbye, and Jai Hind.